Hello, New York Giants fans, and welcome to the Valentine's Views podcast here on YouTube. Please like, share, and subscribe to support the channel. All right, this is our final episode before the New York Giants hit the field for training camp on Wednesday morning. And I have here to discuss the Giants and training camp and the preseason and a lot of that stuff. I have the great Matt Waldman of the Rookie Scouting Portfolio. Matt, how you doing?
I'm doing great, Ed. It's always a pleasure to get a chance to chop it up with you.
Got a question, though, before we even get serious here. Got a question. I saw your little Branford Marsalis video the other day. I saw that. So you're going to play us out here today? You're going to play us out?
I don't have it set up right now.
Oh, bummer. All right.
Yeah,
well, all good. Right. All good.
All right.
I saw that. I enjoyed it.
I appreciate it.
You know, we gotta. I love it. Got to get a. You gotta get away from the work once in a while.
So. Oh, absolutely. And that was my first two loves were music and football. So cool. So it's fun to be able to do both.
See, this is why I played golf 3 days in a row before we came home from camp, and this is why my back is killing me, and I'm going to regret that all week. So, but I played three days in a row. I played golf. What was it? Sunday? I'm going to go play. It was fine for the first 4 holes until it started to downpour.
There you go.
And I was walking. So I was very, very wet by the time we were done.
Yeah. So you feel like me and my daily dog walks with my Catahoula leopard dog pit bull mix, who likes to go in streams, and we're hiking up streams for like a half a mile out of the walk. So
you walk in your bathing suit?
Let me just put it this way. Baking soda and my boots have become a big thing. So
there you go.
Yeah. So
there you go.
I feel you. Well,
all right.
Well, at least you got to hit a ball around, so that's good.
There you go. So hey, let's talk New York Giants. Let's talk training camp, and I want to start with you've done some work in the past on the idea of how fans should watch training camp, how they should watch the preseason, what it means, what they should pay attention to. And that's kind of where I want to start. I mean, I've been covering Giants training camp since 2008. And the one thing that I've learned in all that time is we think we know what we see, but we really don't know what we see, because 95% of the time we don't have the context. And I think that leads into a lot of what you've talked about. So just in general, talk a little bit about your feelings about what we see during training camp.
Yeah. I mean, I think if we're going to take the pessimistic view, then we're going to talk about maybe the optimistic view after that, and then maybe more the balanced, realistic view of how we look at this. Like my pessimistic, just initial point of this is that training camp being open to the public is really about generating ticket sales and generating excitement. People get to see the athletes in motion, and when you get to watch a lot of these one-on-ones, and you see the speed and the leaping ability and the overall explosion and strength of these athletes, it gets you interested in football, because it's kind of like taking the NFL films highlights back in the day when we were growing up, and now you're seeing them up close, and it inspires that awe and wonder. The problem is that there's a lot more to football than a one-on-one game. It's an 11-on-11 game. So there's a lot more that goes on behind that. So then, people get excited about seeing players in shorts and pads, and then seeing, especially from the skill position standpoint, seeing some good passes and displays of athletic ability that are not going to be completely in context of what's important to what they're going to do overall in game situation. The optimistic view is that you do get to see some of the promise and potential of these players, and what could happen once they realize the things that are important with training camp. And I would say the realistic way of looking at this is that with training camp, even if you start with OTAs in April and May, what you're really getting a chance to see is how fast do they pick up on the basic aspects of the system without having any intercommunication or role, um, with their quarterback? What are they on the same page of reading defensive looks as with their quarterback if they're a receiver? We don't get the chance to see them, really in pass protection at the level that we need to see them at. How they handle contact and physical play. And then as we progress into training camp, we start to see more of that. And you see players, maybe depending on their position, whether their physicality comes to the fore, whether they show certain techniques that you want to see. And all of that can look really good. And people start talking about, especially receivers, this guy's turning heads in training camp because he's winning one-on-one fade routes. That's great. But I would say 8 out of 10 receivers can do that in the NFL fairly well. The bigger issue is once you get into the third week of training camp and now you're doing game plan stuff and you're throwing complex looks at players, are they going to line up where they need to line up? Are they going to find the open creases where they need to find them? Are they going to be able to communicate and think on their feet with integrating the game plan with what the adjustments the defense throws at them? And those are the things that really take the most time, and also ability to gain rapport with their teammates in those types of situations. Just learning something and spitting it back out is the initial good thing that we start to see in training camp. But learning something that you can spit back out and then adjust to what the defense is trying to take away, and do it in the same way that your teammates expect you to, and do it in the span of a second. That's the kind of stuff that can take all season for some guys to get better at. So, and even if they're veterans, it's the same thing. Veterans come in from free agency and we see all their strengths on display physically. We see some of their technique on display that's positive, but we don't always see whether they have the conceptual mastery of the game plan and the game to integrate all of that into productive play. And so you're really looking for drum beats during training camp of like layers of positive reviews about players. And then as we get from like the physicals, what we're really looking at in spring, in late July, early August, you're starting to see whether some technique stuff is good. And then by late August, what we want to hear is the quarterback saying that this person really has a good mastery of the offense, or the coaches saying that they're reliable in what we're expecting them to do. They make good adjustments. They're on the same page with their teammates. And when you start seeing those things, then I think that's reason to get somewhat excited. But then here's the crazy thing. Football is a performance medium. We just talked about music a little bit. It's easy to sit there and do something that looks good, in practice. But coaches will and other players will tell you over and over again, when the lights come on and now it's time to play for pay. Um, I joke, it's called like the red button effect. If you ever record yourself, it's like being on stage. You can sound great, and then you go to record yourself, and then the expectation changes psychologically. It's the same way. Ben Watson, the former tight end, told me once when I interviewed him back in the day, of what was like playing at Duke, Georgia, and then at New England. And he said, Duke and Georgia, ACC, SEC, big schools, Georgia especially, very fervent fan base and all of that. He said, but coming to New England in my first game and playing with grown men who were relying on you to support their families and pay their mortgages, you could feel the intensity ratchet up massively. And so the point for that is that oftentimes in practice, there's a lot of practice all-stars. And then when the games happen, is the game at a slow pace for them so that they can actually make the adjustments that need to make and play at a high level? And that's something that we may not see until the first month of the season.
One of the things, you mentioned practice all-stars, and you mentioned some of these one-on-one drills, and like the one-on-one receiver versus cornerback drills, tight end versus safety drills. Those things draw a lot of oohs and ahs from the crowd. And I'll be honest, when I sit there and write the practice reports, they also draw a lot of the they'll draw mentions in the practice reports. They get attention. But here's the thing. They're not 100% realistic.
No.
In mandatory minicamp, I watched Chase Cota, was a wide receiver for the Giants, guy who was bottom of the depth chart, probably not going to make the roster, made a tremendous diving catch on a deep ball, but they weren't wearing pads. And you know what? He broke his collarbone making that catch. You know who's not even going to try to make that play in training camp? Darius Slayton
Right.
or Wandale Robinson or Malik Neighbors isn't even going to try to make that play. You know who's not going to line up? You know, they may battle a little bit in training camp, but you know who's not going to give Malik Neighbors everything he has in training camp is Deonte Banks.
Right.
If there's a 50-50 ball, Deonte Banks is probably going to just let Malik Neighbors have it. All right. They're not going to compete at the same level they would compete in week one. So there's a lot of things that you see. You know, you see times when a quarterback will make what looks like a great throw, except for the fact that if you count, because he's wearing a red jersey and nobody blew the whistle, he's patted the ball 10 times and been in the pocket for five or 6 seconds because he knows nobody can hit him. The play would have been over 3 seconds ago before he releases the ball.
Yep. And
so a lot of it is just, you have to take it in context, and a lot of it is not what you would see in real game condition.
yeah, that's fantastic points. I mean, oftentimes with the receiver drills, you'll also see where it's one-on-ones in the middle of the field. And when you're lined up in the middle of the field, that means that the receiver has what's called a two-way go. And that means that they have the inherent advantage because the defender has to defend both sides of the field without the boundary as their aid. And so oftentimes in like all-star games or in football, any football practice, when people report on how this player is unguardable in the beginning, you know, in drills, you have to understand that that's an issue. But then then there's the opposite side of all of this. And I love the point you brought about the quarterback, because, you know, when you have 5 seconds, anybody who's on an NFL roster, aspiring to make an NFL roster, should make great throws if they've got 5 to 7 seconds to throw football at this level. But there's the opposite too. You know, people would complain about, I remember Jamar Chase dropping footballs as a rookie in practice, and that everyone was worried about his hands, even though he had great hands at LSU. Or Tom Brady throwing lots of interceptions in practice in New England. Or I remember Patrick Mahomes and people tracking his interception rate his second year in practices. And what people don't realize is that practice is about, for many of these players, maybe the young players that you brought up, like a Chase Cota, he's trying to make the team, so he's going all out. Guys who know that they're going to make the roster, and now it's about staying healthy and making sure they understand the things they understand so that they can go all out in games and be ready. Those guys also have the opportunity to work at their craft and take chances with certain things, conceptually or technique wise, that maybe that they want to get some work at. Maybe Tom Brady wants to, you know, he's talked about, he goes, there's a lot of times I would throw the ball into windows that I wouldn't normally throw into games, but
because he wants to know if he can make that throw into that window.
Yep.
Or what he wants to know, Eli Manning used to throw, you know, and Eli threw a lot of interceptions in his career, but he used to throw interceptions in training camp that would make you shake your head. But what he was trying to do is find out what his receiver would do. Could his receiver be relied on to make that play?
You have to explore the boundaries, and sometimes you have to go past that boundary to know where the boundary is. And people react to that because, again, especially young internet, you know, journalism, you're going to see that. We've all done it. And, you know, you're starting out, you look at stuff, and you're learning the game and you're learning how practices work. And also with drills, you'll hear this. I remember he's a terrific veteran, and Paul Kuharski, the former ESPN reporter who does the Titans work. But I remember, you know, and this just tells you that you've got very experienced journalists who do good work, and he does good work, you know. But I remember back in the day when Derrick Henry was a rookie, and he brought up a footwork drill where Derrick Henry looked really sloppy and didn't look like he knew what he was doing at all. And there were concerns from certain internet scouting sources that Derrick Henry didn't have great feet. And so first thing you see is this footwork drill in training camp and how he was struggling to do it. And Paul Kuharsky had put that out there and kind of said, this doesn't look great, you know, and commented on it. I reached out to a friend of mine, Chad Spann, who's a running back coach, who's worked with a number of different pros and was a former NFL and CFL running back, and was like the touchdown leader in the NCAA during the year that Cam Newton won the Heisman. So he was a good player. And I asked him, tell me about this footwork drill. Is this a common footwork drill you're seeing here from Derrick Henry? Is this something that people should be concerned about? Or is this something that, what do you think of this? He goes, first of all, this was not a common footwork pattern. And there are certain common patterns that are out there that most running backs know if they've played major college football. This is not one of them. And even if it was something that he didn't, that was common and he hadn't learned it, I've seen enough of his footwork and footwork drills to know that he's good. This is just something he's unfamiliar with, and they caught him in an unfamiliar moment. And people don't understand that drills last 5 minutes, and then they blow the whistle and go to the next drill. And it's like playing, we brought up music, or you brought up music earlier. It's like if you have your kid in high school band or something, they're going to warm up and they're going to do some things just to like get them warmed up. But if the kid wants to master each of the things that they went through in warm-ups, they're going to spend hours over a period of months to really perfect those types of things that they do in 5 minutes in a classroom. And it's the same thing with football practice. You're going to run certain patterns and, do certain things with your feet, or run certain, do certain drills like that. They're expecting you to spend time after work to prep and master those techniques if you haven't already mastered them.
Not to mention the fact that if you're trying to get better at your craft, occasionally you should be handed things that you struggle with, or that aren't easy for you to do.
You're not practicing if you're just doing something that you already know how to do over and over again. You're not really practicing. You're just playing around. If you're, a sign that you're practicing is that you're struggling with something that's just beyond your grasp.
There's another part of, we're talking a lot about context, and we're talking a lot about really, what you see and the purpose of what you see. And one of the things that I learned is we get all excited as media members, as guys that are there every day. Oh my God, such and such rookies working with the first team in the fifth or sixth practice of training camp. And we get all excited. And I remember 2 years ago, there was a fullback, Jeremiah Hall, out of Oklahoma. And he was all of a sudden working with the Giants first team. This might have been Joe Judge's last year as head coach. And we're all fired up about, the Giants need a guy with this skill set and yada, yada, yada. And somebody who had been around the Giants a lot longer than I had said, something you need to remember is that sometimes these guys get opportunities not to rule them in, but to rule them out. And 2 weeks later, Jeremiah Hall got cut. And I was like, what? But you learn that it's not always what you see isn't always what you think you see.
Yeah, no, it's a great point. And because there's a lot going on, somebody gets hurt, somebody has a cramp, somebody has to leave practice early, or they see something that they like out of the player, but they're like, we know that we're not going to get to see, like you said, see something that may rule them out until we put them in against somebody who's able to perform in a certain way that could counter what they're doing, what the other guy's doing well, so, or we want to see how they match up with somebody with a certain size or certain skill sets. And so we're putting them there because of that. So, I mean, if anything, that's why it's like early on, you may see certain good techniques. You may see displays of size, strength, speed, explosion. And those are layers of information. And so you want to keep accumulating those layers of information so that you can frame them in a proper context. And that takes more than a week's worth of practices. It takes months. And then early on is the confirmation with the game. And even with the game, sometimes guys come in and they perform well early, and then the defenses adjust to what was successful in that game plan that showcased that player, and now they're struggling. Like, perfect example is Chase Claypool. With the Steelers, the first 6 weeks he was on fire statistically, of his career. And then when you watch the tape, I remember studying this and writing this at Football Guys and doing an analysis and saying, if you watch the tape, the defenses were, especially in zone, were prioritizing where they flowed, either to Deontay Johnson or Juju Smith-Schuster. And Claypool was the third option. You've got a veteran quarterback in Ben Roethlisberger. He knows what's going to happen. So he's like, I'm going to hit Claypool wide open all day because the defense is giving me that much cushion. And then on the deep routes, you saw that defenders weren't playing tight to Claypool early because they were afraid that Claypool's size and speed, if they beat the cornerbacks early, that they wouldn't be able to recover. So he would get lots of room to make these plays at the boundary. After week 6, defenses adjusted. They made Claypool the priority in zone, the first priority to flow to, and the cornerback started playing him tight and physical before the catch point, and Chase Claypool's production plummeted. In contrast, you'll have guys like Tank Bigsby last year, who everyone was raving about for the Jaguars, a rookie out of Auburn, and they were like, he's ready to go. He's going to be the 1A to or 1B to Travis Etienne, and we're excited about him. We think he's going to have a great season. He's going to off to a hot start. The beat writers were just gushing over this guy. In the real season, bounced a lot of plays outside that he shouldn't have, fumbled the ball multiple times, dropped passes that created 2 interceptions for Trevor Lawrence, and you didn't see him see much of the field after like week 5 or week 6, and now they're writing it up as that he had to adjust and that he just wasn't quite ready for the league. But he looked ready to a lot of people in the summer. So again, that's that point, is that when the games start, that players start overthinking a little bit.
And I think we saw a little bit of that last year with Jalen Hyatt. But there was one other thing that I wanted to mention. When Brian Daboll was in his first year with the Giants, we saw Daniel Jones in training camp throw interception after interception after interception, and they were all picked off by Darnay Holmes. And we're sitting there left with 2 impressions. Daniel Jones is terrible. This is never going to work. The Giants are going to have to find another quarterback. And second of all, Darnay Holmes is headed for an all-pro season.
Right.
Well, Darnay Holmes ended up on the bench. Daniel Jones had the best year of his career. And what we found out later from Brian Daboll was you have to realize 2 things. First of all, I put Daniel Jones in 3rd and long the entire training camp. And they let Wink Martindale run his entire blitz package against a brand new offensive line. And finally, we found out that basically they were tipping Darnay Holmes off to the plays. They were trying to test Daniel Jones to see how he would handle that adversity. That's context we didn't have while we were writing. It's not context you can get on the field. And I got to be honest, you talk about, we're talking to other people during practice. We're 100 yards away.
Yep.
There's bodies in our way. We can't see everything. There's context. We're reporting the best that we can on what we see, but there's a lot of context. And yes, we have access, but there's a lot that we cannot see just based on distance and people in front of us and things going on 3 different fields at the same time. So there's a lot of context that people should be aware of.
Yeah, and I think that's probably one of the greatest overall points for people to understand. I remember the first time I went to the Senior Bowl, probably almost 20 years ago, and watch practices to report on them for the New York Times Fifth Down blog, and work when I was doing work for them for a few years. And I remember the first day of practice, I just stood there and watched. And I just watched everything unfold. And I go, how am I going to attack this? And I watched how everyone else was doing it. And I saw a lot of people talking to each other. I saw a lot of people moving around in different spots. Then afterwards, we had lunch with a bunch of different reporters and different scouts, and they would talk about what they saw and what they liked. And oftentimes it was conflicting. The overall views were conflicting depending on their perspective and experience. And at that point, I had some freedom to write about what I was going to write about. So I decided the next day I was just going to cover receivers. That was it. I was just going to do receivers, and I was going to follow them around at everything they did at practice. And I did that with positions for a while. And then I was able to get access to practice tape afterwards. The thing is that when you have a deadline and you're writing about practice, do you really want to spend 6 hours breaking down the tape of every practice that you watch, if you even have access to some of that? The answer is sometimes it can be very effective and helpful, but oftentimes even then you're still lacking the context of some of the things you brought up, like that Wink Martindale story with Hall and Jones and what Dable was doing. That's a great story. That's a great example of what people generally don't understand with practice. And when you have all this stuff going on, it's a carnival, and so you kind of have to either you have to focus on something, or you're looking at the highlights and having to give people, hey, context is important here, so let's just understand that. Let's not get too excited or too down about these things. I'm just going to show you what we saw.
Absolutely. Matt, let's turn our attention a little bit to the Giants. And one of the realities of the Giants this year is you read all these roster rankings and everybody says, oh, the Giants have one of the worst rosters in football. And I'm not necessarily sure that I buy that. What I buy is the fact that I think they have a lot of talented players in positions where they're either rookies or they haven't been given that opportunity yet. And you focus on the skill positions. The Giants drafted 3 of those guys: Malik Neighbors, Theo Johnson, and Tyrone Tracy, the running back. Let's talk about those 3 guys and just what your expectations are for those guys. Go ahead and take them one at a time. What are your expectations, football wise, fantasy wise, all of that, just in terms of what they'll bring to the table this year?
Sure. And let's just start with this, is that, the big priority that the Giants have talked about, and I know that the Mara family has mentioned, is offensive line. If this is the type of team overall where, you're going to hear when people do the roster rankings, yeah, they'll say that this isn't a great team or this is a weak team. But I agree with you that if this offensive line plays competently and maybe even well above average, then they can do enough to help unlock the offensive skill talent on this team. And there is offensive skill talent on this team. So let's start with Theo Johnson, the tight end. Okay. You got Daniel Bellinger, who I think we all know that he's a decent blocker. He can give you some lead blocking. He can give you a little bit of H-back, fullback type of work, and he can help you in the underneath flats and the underneath zones in the passing game as a reliable pass catcher. He can give you a little bit after the catch. Johnson is really the most dynamic receiver potential-wise in the tight end room. He's got the size to be an every down tight end. He has the initial explosion and speed to threaten the seam. He's got some shiftiness to be able to make people miss, and he can break tackles. And he catches the ball reasonably well. The big question with him, once he gets healthy and he's off the PUP list, is that he can he develop his one-on-one game as a man-to-man receiver? His footwork looks great against zone or off-man coverage. When he has to face tight man-to-man or physical play at the line, his footwork suddenly looks a little bit more like it's plodding, and he's operating in mud a little bit. So if he can clean that up during his first season and really become as good at man-to-man as he looks at zone, you're going to have a guy who could be a weapon for you, can be a starter, and maybe even be one of the top 3 to 4 receiving options on the team.
Matt,
Yeah,
before you move off Johnson,
yeah,
Brian Daboll spoke in the spring about Johnson and about the tight end position and about how the tight end position at the NFL level is really like learning a whole bunch of different positions.
yes.
Just quickly, for a kid like Johnson, I mean, how we see tight ends a lot of times come into the league and it takes them a while. How complicated is the tight end position to learn at the NFL level?
It's one of the hardest in the league, because it depends on the role that they want to provide. If the team says, we just want you to be a blocker, and you're already a decent blocker, you're like that 6th offensive lineman, then depending on whether they're using you on the front side or the back side, or whether they're asking you to pull or work across formations and how much athletic ability you have, the tight end is really like the reason the tight end is so valuable in the NFL is that is the most it's the flex position on the football field. So depending on what tools you have in your tool bag, that one day they ask you to be an electrician, the next day they're asking you to be a plumber, the next day they're asking you to do drywall, now you're repairing roofs, now you're building a deck, and some of those things have similar skills. Some of those things are vastly different and require different physical conceptual makeup and training. And so a guy like Johnson, he fits in that mold of the all-around tight end in terms of physical dimensions. So think about, if you think right away about who's like an all-around, can block front side, be that 6 offensive lineman, but also can move from a fullback position and also run seam routes and get open down the deep seam and win after the catch and split them out wide too. The only tight end I can remember in recent memory who did all those things exceedingly well was Rob Gronkowski. He was a unicorn. George Kittle comes close, but the rest of these guys who are like big names are mostly wide receivers, So Johnson's more in that Gronkowski build. So, but the question is, how are they planning on using him? So, it's hard enough to be a good receiver with those athletic skills. And he was more receiver first at Iowa. I know Iowa has good blockers, but even Sam Laporta, who came out of Iowa, was more wide receiver first. And they have Brock Wright in Detroit, who's really handling the inline duties. And so, if Theo Johnson's expected to be a front side blocker, be it that 6 offensive lineman, it's going to take him some time, because that's the hardest thing to do in the NFL is to block those athletic defenders in the box. And then you're asking him to win one-on-one against, top man-to-man coverage. These are opposing skill sets. These are very diverse skill sets. And you're asking them to learn assignments and be assignment savvy with blitz pickups and run calls and changes of calls at the line. And then you're also asking them to be on the same page with Daniel Jones against zone coverage and different coverage disguises in the middle of the field, which is the toughest area to get open because you're dealing with all those bodies. So the processing speed and the diverse skill sets of the tight end position are, I think, maybe the second hardest thing to learn on offense in the NFL, just behind quarterback.
All right, now you can talk about Malik Neighbors and Tyrone Tracy in whichever order you choose.
Sure. Let's do Tyrone Tracy because we'll save the best for last. Okay, but like Tyrone Tracy, what people are going to see right away is the speed, decent size, former receiver. People are going to talk about his hands. He's got some really nice movement skills. And in a Giants offense that's going to run its fair share of gap plays, like power, toss, counter, Tyrone Tracy can do some effective work for you, maybe even right away in this offense as a runner and maybe a screen receiver or RPOs or different types of dump off passes. I think he can be very good there. There's a reason why he's a running back and not a receiver, because if you watch his receiver tape at, I want to say it was Iowa, but where when he was at Iowa, when you watch his receiver tape there, it wasn't all that impressive, especially in the hands department, if you ask me. But as a running back, there's some real promise there, and he does offer probably the best big play element from the backfield that the Giants have right now. So he's going to get an opportunity early as long as he can show some competency with basic pass pro assignments that they, because he's going to, sometimes they're going to have to make adjustments where they were going to run it. Now they got to throw it. And Tracy's going to have to be able to protect and pick up those assignments. Well, that's going to be a bit of a question mark, but it's something that players can learn quickly. And can he be mature about not trying to out athlete people at this level? Because he could do that he could do that in college, but he didn't always. But that's not always going to project well for the NFL. But good, promising young athlete who in a gap-based system could give you what people hoped Tevin Coleman could give the Atlanta Falcons back in the day, and sometimes did.
And Malik Neighbors, as you said, best for last.
Yep, he's the best wide receiver in this draft class, period. I know that people think Marvin Harrison Jr. is, and Marvin Harrison Jr. is a very good receiver. But I would take Malik Neighbors 8 days a week over Marvin Harrison Jr., even if Marvin Harrison Jr. has more production, because arguably he has a system that may be a little bit more friendly for that production, may have a little bit more, maybe has a quarterback who can create a little bit more in certain manners. But I wouldn't be surprised when we watch Marvin Harrison Jr., just to finish this little tangent about him, that we see more drops out of Marvin Harrison Jr. than people realize. He's got his highs with his hands are fantastic. There's some lows with his game that are going to get exacerbated or possibly get exacerbated by tight man-to-man coverage and throws into tight windows. Neighbors to me, I heard Darius Slayton say he reminds him of Jamar Chase. He reminded me of a better version of Odell Beckham. And great route runner. I mean, really has a mastery at this point of, most college receivers who are even decent, who have a shot to develop playing time, they lean on one or two moves at the line of scrimmage against press coverage. Malik Neighbors has a library already, and he can combine a variety of different ways to get open efficiently. It's not playground, it's efficient. It shows a real understanding of what moves to apply versus what position defenders are in. He is comfortable with physical play. He's not going to box people out in a physical sort of way. He's not Brandon Marshall. Okay. That's like but he's a guy who's going to earn position with his movement, with his route running, and make the play and get ping ponged off defenders and come down with the ball. And if there's room after the catch, he's going to exploit that too. He's going to find the open seams. He's going to make people miss. He'll occasionally break some tackles. He is wide receiver 1 in this class. He's wide receiver 1 on this team. And I think it helps guys like Hyatt and Slayton. And if Allen Robinson, finds a way out of the mid to late career funk that he had or decline that he had and plays like he did early in his career, this offense, especially if the offensive line with their 2, early round tackles, their early round center, and guys like Runyon and I can't pronounce Jermaine's last name,
Illuminor.
Yep. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Or Stinney, if you can get one of those guys, if you can get a couple good guard, get some guard play and your tackles play to expectation, then you're giving Jones enough time, and he may need a little extra time. I've always thought Jones, well, I've said some things about Jones in terms of how he, as a draft player, but I would say Jones is at the median of what's startable for a quarterback. And if you can give him, he's the type of player. I look at Joe Flacco as an example. Joe Flacco, if you give him a great team around him, he can make plays for you. Or he was able to at the height of his career. And then as he gained more experience and knowledge, you can see what he did in Cleveland, later in the season as a wizened veteran. I think that Jones is kind of that type of player. If you give him the talent, he's going to need a little extra around him. And he didn't have that at receiver. Darius Slayton being the primary receiver was probably a little bit of a miscast thing, but maybe as the number two with teams occupying Neighbors the way that they're going to have to occupy him. Slayton and Hyatt, that opens things up for those guys, for Wandale. And if Allen Robinson, I mean, listen, I don't know what's happened over the years since his final years in Chicago, but if he has enough athletically and he can play to the level that he was capable of, this receiving core could look like a 180 from last year.
You mentioned Daniel Jones, and let's just close on Jones a little bit. In your mind, did the Giants do the right thing in the circumstance they were in? Their choice at that point was really J.J. McCarthy, or get Malik Neighbors and give Jones a weapon. Did they do the right thing? And everybody says, oh, there's no hope with Daniel Jones, and we already know what he is. If he has the offensive line with the weapons they've given him, if they stay healthy, can Jones do enough this year to show the Giants that he can be the quarterback for the Giants after this year? Or do you see this as Jones' last hurrah in New York?
Yeah, I think he's a lame duck at this point. I think it's his last hurrah, but only because of this, is that teams tend to, the NFL and especially fans and media tend to view quarterbacks this way. They're either elite franchise options or they're terrible. There's no in between in terms of how people view them. And he's in that in between stage. He's like Derek Carr, Joe Flacco, in the sense of like, put him on another team, let him get an opportunity to work in a strong offense that may be suited to his skills, and maybe he can help you get to a playoff. More likely that he's going to be more of a journeyman starter or journeyman reserve who can come in and give you solid play when they need him to. And this is his audition to kind of differentiate himself between that range.
He becomes Andy Dalton.
Yes, exactly. Exactly. And I think the way they set this up was good because they have Jones. They got Drew Lock, who is, a talented thrower of the football, he has some talented tech. He's a talented technician, talented athlete. And he is, I think, just figuring out in the past few years what it needed to take to be that every week starter. I think he's at least realized it. Whether he's applying what he needs to apply is there. I'll tell a quick story if you don't mind.
Go ahead.
With this is that when I studied Drew Lock, I remember people were comparing him to Patrick Mahomes because of his ability to throw sidearm and go outside the pocket, and there were a lot of people talking about him like that. And I was like, Drew Lock, the problem with Drew was that he had a massive amount of talent and he played at Missouri. And when you watched him at Missouri in the SEC, they were a mid-level team and they couldn't get another quarterback like Drew Lock to compete with them. So when he's at Missouri and when they're playing the middle or lower level SEC teams or teams that weren't at that level, he could get away with things that he wasn't going to get away with in the NFL in terms of decision making and concepts. And people would say he looks great. Then he'd face the LSU, Florida, Georgia, Alabamas of the SEC, and he looked like the kid who had a school project that required weeks of work, and he tried to put it all together the night before, and it just didn't. You could tell that the work wasn't there, and he would try to do those things that he needed to work at, and it wasn't happening. And you could tell that when he would work with coaches, that probably coaches were like, these are things that you're probably going to need to keep working on to get better in the league. But they're not at a program where they're like, we got a 5-star prospect breathing down your neck and we're going to bench you if you don't get this better. They're just like, they know what they had. They know they had a good quarterback, but he was the man, and he tacitly knew that. And I'm not saying he's a bad kid or anything like that. It's just normal maturity. And so the hook to the story is that my buddy Cecil Lammey over in Denver, who's a beat reporter and does daytime radio covering the Broncos for the past 20 years. He talked to Drew Lock's dad the year that Drew Lock and Teddy Bridgewater were competing for the job. And Drew Lock got a call from Peyton Manning when he was drafted. And Peyton said, anything you need, you let me know. And I'm thinking, as a 54-year-old man, I have the hindsight and the experience to think if I was in Drew Lock's position, I'd say, can I live in your garage and do chores for you? And you show me everything and anything that I need to do and work with me to help me become the quarterback that I can be. That's what I would probably do if Peyton Manning called me up and said, is there anything that I can do? Drew said, thanks a lot, hung up the phone politely, went about his work without Peyton. Then when Teddy Bridgewater was brought in to compete with him, he called up Peyton Manning 3 years later. So when Cecil Lammey interviewed his dad's like, listen, I love Drew. Drew's a great kid. And I say this, but we've been trying to tell Drew for years, since high school, here's the things you need to work on. Here's the way you need to approach the game. If you want to be a top pro, you have the ability. You just have to figure out these things. And I think when Drew lost the job to Teddy Bridgewater in Denver and wound up in Seattle, I think he had that realization. And that doesn't make him a bad guy. It just makes him a normal person in their early 20s who was told they were awesome for years by everybody except maybe a few key people who still thought he was awesome, but thought, here's the things that you can get better at. And he didn't have that perspective. And I think that Seattle game where he helped bring them back and they interviewed him at the sideline and he was really emotional and said, wasn't sure if I was ever going to get the opportunity to do this again. I think he's had a realization that his team is there. So that what he needs to know. And the fact that he came into New York here, and they asked him about, his role. And he said, I'm here to back up Daniel Jones. Daniel Jones is the starter. That's the right thing to say. That's what you got to do. But I wouldn't be surprised if the offensive line isn't playing up to its level, that we might not see Drew Lock at some point during the season. And it gives them some promise. And it also gives them some promise that if there's nobody when they let Daniel Jones walk next year, which is, I think, what's going to happen, that they have Drew as a journeyman bridge between, the next rookie that they can draft. Because next year's class, there's some guys that are interesting, but I'm not sure it's like this past class was a better class. And so a lot of people are saying, well, shouldn't we have drafted one? And my answer is, when you can get a Malik Neighbors and change the dynamic of your receiving core and give your current quarterbacks a chance to win and have a dynamic primary wide receiver one, even if those quarterbacks don't pan out, you've made your team more appealing and focused on your offensive line as well, so that maybe even a free agent you can get who might be an upgrade to either one.
Besides, Daniel Jeremiah the other day compared Carson Beck to Eli Manning. So I'm sure that perked up John Mara's ears. And if he can't get Carson Beck, he can wait a couple more years and get Arch Manning.
See, there you go. And it's funny because Carson Beck is the one player that came to mind. And I will say this, a quarterback coach that I do work with, who's worked with Brock Purdy and Anthony Richardson and Caleb Williams by the name of Will Hewlett. And I provide scouting reports to him and the guys over at Cortex. Will told me, he said, the one guy I've seen thus far who looks like an NFL quarterback, at least from a throwing perspective, that he said was Carson Beck when he was talking about this class. I haven't studied Beck yet, but I can understand why Will probably feels that way from what I've seen. But so Beck is probably, and from what I've seen of the other passers out there, Beck probably would be the best fit from what I've seen thus far. So, well, I'm sure we'll talk about it again in March or April,
There you go. I'm sure, we got to leave something to talk about a few months from now. All right, Matt, thank you as always for the time. Giants fans, thank you as always for listening. Please stay safe out there. Take care of each other, and we'll talk to you soon. Bye-bye.